So I want to welcome everyone in the room today and everyone watching online on the live stream. Today we'll be talking about Palestinian journalists, those on the ground reporting and who also call the West Bank and Gaza home. They are the reason that the world knows what we know about what is happening in Gaza and what is happening in the West Bank. And it's become a uniquely dangerous and deadly job. For those of you who were here this morning, the scroll of the many people who were killed took several minutes to go through. And the statistics on the number of journalists who are dying is really unprecedented. 75% of the journalists killed worldwide in 2023 were killed in Gaza. And as many journalists were killed in Gaza in 7 months, then have been killed in Mexico, a famously dangerous place to be a journalist, in 20 years. Each of these 4 panelists here today have a unique vantage point on the challenges these journalists face and how they are perceived and reported on by Western media outlets. My name is Rana Natur, and I'll be moderating this discussion today. Each of our panelists will have the floor for around 8 minutes, and we'll discuss some things together, and then we'll take questions from you, the audience. Those in the room can submit your questions on the index cards that are on your seats. And for those of you watching on the live stream, you can submit your questions on Zoom via the question and answer feature, or you can email events@arabcenterdc.org. Now, I want to introduce our panelists, and you can find their full bios on the conference program that are on your seat. Lina Abu Akleh. She is a Palestinian-Armenian human rights advocate. She is the niece of the symposium's namesake, the late journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She has tirelessly fought for justice and accountability into her killing. Karen Attiah is a global opinions editor and columnist for the Washington Post. I highly recommend her Twitter and her column. She has very insightful commentary. Sherif Mansour is an Egyptian-American human rights advocate, formerly with the Committee to Protect Journalists. He ran their MINA program. And Eman Mohamed, she's a photojournalist from Gaza, a senior TED fellow and author of the photographic memoir, The Cracks in My Lens. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Lina, I want to start with you. You're still fighting for accountability into the killing of your aunt, Shireen Abu Akleh. What has it been like for you to watch this all unfold in Gaza, and what can you impart from your experience?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Arab Center for organizing this. It's a very important symposium that honors Shireen's legacy. And most importantly, it keeps her story alive and honors all the other Palestinian journalists who've been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza over the past 7 months. I'd just like to say that with all these events and awards that are dedicated to Shireen, it really gives solace to our family. It's very comforting. But at the same time, it honors her legacy and shows that she's still among us, and people still talk about her, and younger generations continue to be empowered by her. And to answer your question, it's been very difficult. Our efforts into achieving justice for Shireen has been very, very difficult. Sherif and I were just saying that last year around this time we were in Ramallah while they were presenting their report on number of journalists killed in Palestine. So the past 2 years feel like it went by very fast, but unfortunately, 2 years later, and we still don't have justice, we still don't have accountability. The US administration has failed our family, has failed Shireen, an American citizen, a journalist, a female journalist. Until this day, we still continue to go into the halls of the Congress, the Senate, and we continue our efforts in asking and calling for the ICC to open an investigation. So it definitely has not been an easy journey, I would say, especially continuing to call for just the bare minimum of just justice. And from day one, we've been saying that if we don't have justice for Shireen, then this will give the green light to kill more journalists. And we've seen that ever since Shireen was killed 2 years ago. No one has been held accountable, and more than 100 Palestinian journalists have been killed. That includes Al Jazeera's Samir Abu Akleh and family members of Wa'il al-Dahdouh, including his son, who is also a journalist. And Israel shut down Al Jazeera's operations just a few days after World Press Freedom Day. So ever since Shireen's killing, there's been continuous, indiscriminate killing and targeting of journalists. And it's not just killing journalists, but also harassing journalists, whether that's in the West Bank or in Jerusalem. So for our family, our main call was we want justice because we don't want this to happen to other journalists. We don't want other families to go through the same pain as we did. Advocating should have not been our role as a family. We should have been mourning. And unfortunately, we don't talk about this as often, but they didn't just kill Shireen. They also attacked the funeral. Mm-hmm. And that was another violation. That was another attack and a violation to her dignity and our right to put her to rest. So we feel that it was silencing Shireen twice, first in Jenin, second in Jerusalem. So the fact that we were not able to mourn as a family and had to take the role of advocating day in, day out for 2 years now is infuriating. And just the past 2 days, we've been meeting with senators, we've been meeting with members of Congress and reiterating our demands and calls, which is just justice. We are pushing them to actually do the bare minimum of giving us the main information as to what happened, where's the investigation. The last thing we know is that the FBI opened an investigation just a few months after Shireen was killed, but we still don't know where that investigation is heading towards. We haven't received any updates, and the same goes for the ICC case. Nothing has been updated. So again, the US administration failed our family. I mean, that's not a surprise, but yeah, they failed our family. They kept telling us that we want to have a credible investigation. That was Secretary Blinken who mentioned it when we had met with him in July of 2022. He promised for there to be a credible investigation, an open communication, but that was the last communication we've had with him. So nothing has been, they haven't said anything. So it's absolutely infuriating, but here we are, we keep going, we're continuing, because as Layla mentioned, if there's no justice for Shireen, then how can we guarantee that there'll be ever justice for all the countless Palestinians killed, but also all the journalists who've been continuously targeted?
Do you think anything about your fight for accountability and what it exposed, as far as how her death was reported on by other media outlets, and the way that Israel's narrative developed, and the way that US officials will go up to the line of saying how terrible it is until they actually have to do something about it? Did that, do you think, apply to the conversations that we've been having about how Palestinian journalists are being treated and reported on and killed in Gaza? Do you see any changes or discourse that is happening now?
Well, in the case of Shireen, I remember the first few days, we saw how the media covered it. Oftentimes, they started with saying she died at the age of 51, magically died. Or they didn't even mention who killed her. She was killed. She died in the occupied West Bank. There was no context, nothing. No one, if you don't know Shireen, you wouldn't have known what was happening. It was very disheartening. It was very infuriating to see how fellow journalists would cover the killing of a journalist like Shireen. It was dehumanizing, as we've been mentioning. And also the Israeli government, the Israeli media, they obviously had multiple narratives. From what we counted, I think there were like 7 narratives. They changed multiple times, and they kept denying what happened. And we also saw this in multiple instances in Gaza. I remember during the Israeli attack on the Baptist hospital, they initially denied that it was them. And I remember in the midst of all the atrocities and the number of people that were killed in that attack, the Palestinian Health Ministry spokesperson was giving a presser. And the first sentence of his presser was about Shireen. He said, we've seen how the Israeli government denied their responsibility in the killing of Shireen, and they're doing the same now with the targeting of the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital. So yes, we've seen time and time again the playbook, Israel's playbook, and also the Western media in the way they've covered the story, and they've dehumanized the main topic of the story, which is the Palestinians. But also, to add to that point, it's not just the way media dehumanizes the story, but also during our meetings behind closed doors, when we would meet with high officials, with leaders, ambassadors, oftentimes they would look at us and say, oh, thank you so much for being so calm. Thank you so much for being very gentle in the way you've been reacting. Wow. So that was something to see, that it's not just the media, but it's also the way the media encourages these leaders to dehumanize Palestinians time and time again.
Did any of the politicians that you met with tell you something off sides or off the record? I mean, you don't have to name the names, but politicians, when they're not on the record or have a microphone in front of their face, say one thing, but they might say another thing privately. And I'm wondering if you had moments like that.
Oh, definitely. So many instances when we would meet with politicians. One specific instance was with an ambassador to the UN in New York. And he told me, he's like, yes, we know Israel killed Shireen. And later on, he would tweet a photo with me, and he wouldn't mention that it was Israel who killed Shireen. So they would admit behind closed doors, but in the media or on social media, they wouldn't admit it. And oftentimes, we've heard not just politicians, but even staffers telling us, if it was an Israeli-American journalist, then we know that the US would have achieved justice from day one. We wouldn't have been having this conversation. So yeah, it happened in multiple instances, which goes on to show that at the end of the day, just because Shireen was a Palestinian-American journalist, then that has changed the entire formula.
What do you think is most effective if we were going to focus on accountability and awareness for these? CPJ has the number at 97 journalists in Gaza that have been killed. In your experience over these last 2 years, what has been effective and what has been ineffective, you believe to be ineffective, when it comes to navigating these halls of power and this discourse that's been going on around the country?
So one thing that I've seen that has been effective is continuously pushing, keeping a channel of communication with policymakers, with the staffers on the Hill, with senators. That has helped our case. I mean, it only goes so far, but at the end of the day, we come here every year to try to remind them and to tell them that Shireen was killed. Until this day, there's been no justice. What have you done to hold the Israelis accountable for the killing of one of your own citizens, an American citizen? So that is our way that we've been approaching the case, but unfortunately, sometimes we feel we're at a dead end. And we try to push past it, but it's not easy. And just working closely with organizations like CPJ, RSF, and other international and local NGOs and international organizations that have been supportive since day one has really helped in amplifying not just Shireen's story, but also targeting of journalists in general. But the other point is something that it's more of like a question as to, we've had multiple reports coming in from whether it's CPJ or other media organizations showing the number of Palestinian journalists targeted, showing the pattern. I think the most important thing here is the pattern. And the fact that this didn't just happen, the targeting journalists didn't start in October 7. Shireen was killed way before October 7, and this is something that we've reiterated multiple times in our meetings over the past few days on the Hill. We've had all these reports, and we've continuously showed them to policymakers, to politicians, that this is a pattern. So how can you not see the fact that Shireen was killed because of Israeli occupation, Israel's pattern in targeting journalists? And then that is our dead end. Like, how can we navigate through these reports into actually finding a mechanism that implements all these findings in achieving justice for journalists? So that, I think, has been the biggest challenge in our calls for justice and accountability and all the advocacy campaigning.
And Karen, Lina articulated so well her experience of dehumanization with her aunt. And you also experienced this as a late colleague of Jamal Khashoggi. You've written about feeling as though in death he was used as a prop, and you use the words elevated and dehumanized. And this is by his Western counterparts, Western media outlets. I wonder if you could talk to that and your perspective as someone who works with a legacy media organization, one of the organizations that is being pressured to do better as far as their, the way that they frame certain stories and then the way that they approach certain stories.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you to the Arab Center for having me. And it's an honor and a pleasure and in some ways a tragedy that we even have to be here discussing this. And so in some ways, I wish Lina met you under different circumstances. Yes, so in 2017 is when I was the Global Opinions editor, and I hired Jamal Khashoggi. And the whole ethos of the section was to have a space where journalists, writers, people who were actually from the countries could have a space to write about politics, culture from their own perspectives. I sort of wanted to get past the Washington, D.C. interpreter, think tank, analyst, no offense, but, but wanted to basically, I think, do a lot of the job of journalism, which is to hear from people from the countries and from the cultures directly. And so that's how I got in touch with Jamal after the repression in Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohamed bin Salman. This is a little bit of context, right? So it was under that ethos that we as an organization, myself as an editor, along with the writers that we were able to recruit, we were operating from this ethos that these voices, A, that they mattered, B, that they were authorities, C, that they were bringing new perspectives that you don't often hear in Washington. And I think, and Jamal's obviously the most tragic and famous example for a lot of the writers, they were given, or trying to give them space that they weren't getting in their countries. And from my perspective, maybe at this point it was a naive perspective, a certain level of protection. That if they could align themselves with the Washington Post or with the legacy media, that it would give a certain level of visibility and protection to those writers. And Jamal and I were working like normal. We'd have coffees, lunches. I was not a war correspondence editor. I never really thought that what he was doing or what a lot of the other writers were doing was something that would put them in danger. So fast forward a year, almost to the day after we met, he was murdered in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So the decisions that were made to go all out in Jamal's defense, for me, at least, and for the Post, for my late boss at the time, Fred Hyatt, was coming from a genuine ethos of this is what we owe each other as colleagues, what I owe as an editor to protect my writers, and to send a message not only to other journalists that this is the model, this is how you should be, this is how we should think about journalists who risk their lives. In Jamal's case, his family was coming under threat for what he was doing as well. The very least we could do is to speak out in defense. What do I have to lose for that? So we put our resources into that. We saw the other legacy media organizations rally behind us because I was very clear in saying Jamal was a Washington Post journalist. He was a journalist, he was an Arab journalist, and we have a duty to, and in Jamal's work, to elevate and protect, particularly journalists from the region and of the region. And at the time, it seemed all of Washington was behind us, behind me. A lot of the other networks were devoting so much time and coverage to Jamal, literally years of coverage. Now, you go around the world almost, people know a little bit about this story. So sitting here today, I know what the media machine can do when it wants to. You can't tell me, especially, that the silence that I've seen on Palestinian journalists is indefensible, completely indefensible. And so to an extent, when I think about Jamal and Shireen, even there's no reason why Shireen shouldn't have that same level of relentless defense and coverage, because this is what we're supposed to do. Perhaps, again, I'm naive, but I say this a lot on my social media. If you're not a journalist and you're not there to defend people, what is the point? Why are you here? Why are you doing what you're doing? So I've had to do a lot of, it's been a lot of seeing the facade drop and shatter to the floor in terms of whose lives matter. I have to contend with, I have to ask this question because Jamal was targeted. I have to ask this question, so what was so different about this vis-a-vis the Palestinian journalists or the Arab journalists that we claimed that we were going to defend, that we were going to defend against oppressive regimes? Does that not matter when that regime is a US ally? Clearly that seems to be the case. What does that mean for, and I said it before, Jamal's death, Shireen's death, me as an American journalist, I am less safe because of the lack of the accountability in this. And we should all feel that way, but not everybody feels that way, apparently. So I suppose in a legacy media organization, yeah, I've seen the double standard, and it's difficult. But that's why we have to keep our jobs, or my job is to, whatever ways I can in those who, part of my job is to keep that mirror up. To be like, hey, explain to me like I'm 5, and I've said this in Slack channels, literally. Explain to me like I'm 5 what the difference is. And no, you can't use "it's complicated." I'm taking that off the table because this is my game, my rules. You can't use "it's complicated." You can't say, well, we're working on it. No, explain to me the difference between Jamal and Shireen. And usually, it's indefensible, right? So I suppose, it goes back to what we've been saying all along. I do question is it because Trump was in office that we were using Jamal's case as an example of why Trump cozies up to dictators, and Jamal was an example, and therefore that's why, because Jamal was part of this crusade against Trump at the time, meaning that we're not going to do the same when Biden is in power? Is that what you're saying? Is it because it fits the picture of a murderous, butcher, Arab regime? That's why it's easier to do what we did for Jamal and not in the case of Israel? My job is to ask these questions, and usually the answers are not there. But it's revealing about who we value and who we don't. I don't really know how much more to say behind that. But what I can say about this, what we've discussed already, I think it's incredible that at least this story is still alive, that we are at least still talking about it. I think the more people, the more readers, frankly, have the power to ask, again, these questions directly of our editors, directly of our bosses. And the way that I look at it is that an assault on journalists, it's not just an assault on journalists, but it's an assault on memory. It's an assault on culture and on heritage. We are, as journalists, we're writing a very blunt first draft of the culture and of history. In my work in connecting this, I keep saying there's certain things, assaulting journalism to me is on the same spectrum of destroying archives, of destroying museums, of destroying documents. You're trying to erase the history and the memory of a people. And to not defend that or to be silent or to be complicit in that, you're erasing a people. And there's no way, at least me personally, I'm gonna lend my pen to that, right? So, long story, I'm personally still processing a lot of that, and even my role as being propped up as defender of Khashoggi, and those same people who were behind me then, crickets now, a lot of them. And I'm like, okay, I see what the game is, right? But it doesn't matter, you keep going because I don't have a very much more eloquent way to put it. It's the right thing to do. It's why we should be, because if it's not us, then the targets will be someone else later, and we're seeing just in general a rollback, an increase in authoritarianism, a disregard for red lines all over the board. And the common red lines that we thought we'd agreed on, journalists, hospitals, children, heritage, have all been crossed here. This is a dangerous laboratory now. So again, our job is to document it, and in the moment, keep the mirrors up. And while we're keeping shields up, trying to protect our jobs, trying to protect our sanity. So yeah, I'm still, like I said, I'm not saying anything different than I did for Jamal when I speak about Palestinian journalists. And if you were sincere about Jamal, you'd be sincere about Palestinian journalists. And people will say, well, no. So.
Very telling. I think a lot of us feel the way that you've expressed today. And Sherif, I want to turn to you to kind of zoom in on this picture a little more. We know that an unprecedented number of journalists are being killed in Gaza, and these are experienced conflict reporters who have kept themselves safe and know how to keep themselves safe and operate in war zones, but they are dying anyway. What are important patterns that you're seeing that you think we should take note of, and what can you say about intentionality?
Well, thank you again for the Arab Center and for everyone here on this panel. I want to just start saying, but I'm not with CPJ anymore. I quit more than a month ago. I still remember all the statistics. I'm still trying to get over it and recover but I've been there for 11 and a half years doing Middle East work. So the word unprecedented probably was the most word I've used in any public discussion. You can count not just this war, at least 3 other wars in Gaza before my first day, November 19, 2012, was during Gaza war. My first statement was about Israel killing 3 journalists by bombing offices in Gaza, including offices of international media. So I've been documenting the Arab Spring uprising and civil wars, which saw Syrians killed and journalists in Syria killed in an unprecedented way. Since 2012, more 104 journalists were killed in Syria. That made them the deadliest country for the world since 2011. But also before I started, it was Iraq, and still the deadliest country for journalists over 20 years since the Iraq war. So who's on the top now? First Iraq since 1992, then Syria, then Israel, Palestine. The third and the most deadly worldwide, just because of the last 7 months. So when we say unprecedented, it's not just unprecedented, it's unparalleled. You cannot compare what happened in the span of those 7 months to Syria, which happened over more than 10 years, or to Iraq, which happened over more than 20 years. In simple terms, Palestinian journalists were left to bear the brunt of Israeli army fire. We said a statistic about 10 weeks where the Israeli army killed more journalists than any other army or entity have done over a course of a year. But it's not just about the intensity as well. It's the long-standing record of impunity. And that's when we were in Bethlehem in the first anniversary last year of Shireen Abu Akleh, we've decided to release our report at CPJ at the time in Tel Aviv, challenging Israeli officials, Israeli media, about the false narratives that they have produced. And we at the time were happy to see for the first time that the Israeli army spokesperson came out and said, we apologize, Shireen is a journalist. In a democracy, journalists should be respected, especially in time of war. Live on CNN. And this felt different. It wasn't like a PR spin like we've learned and used to from Israeli officials. But it was a sign of hope that they can actually take this seriously. What we said at the time is that it was not a one-off killing, it was a murder. It's one of 3 murders that already happened, including 2 in 2018. Also in Gaza, Yasser Murtaja and Mahmoud Abu Hussein, covering peaceful protests. And Shireen was one of 20 journalists who've been killed by Israeli army fire over 20 years. And none of them have seen justice. And the point we made at the time is that, if it's a pattern, it's not one soldier, it's not one unit, it's not even one government. But most of those times it was also the government of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who've been in power from the beginning of the Gaza wars and have been keeping his autocratic practices against the media in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And we said that this pattern of impunity will have consequences about the ability of journalists to cover IDF activity. We said it was going to be a chilling effect. What we've seen in this war was that the deadly pattern continued much more, and that chilling effect became local, regional, and international censorship on a scale we haven't seen before. And I think what's important to realize here is that Palestinian journalists were left there to bear witness, not just to bear the brunt of the fire. They had no choice to be there. They had no exit. And they had no safe haven. They were killed everywhere in Gaza from day one, including at the two crossing points in the north and in the south, and everywhere in between. And the Israeli government, including the Israeli Supreme Court, denied requests of international media to cover Gaza. And only if you submit to censorship by Israeli army that you're allowed to have any access at all, but in just rare access. And I think this is where the case for impunity becomes unparalleled. This is the first war we cannot actually see unless Palestinian journalists take never seen before sacrifices to themselves, to their families, to their colleagues in order to continue work. And of course, many of them continue to do so now, but some of them have already stopped. And they said, we've done everything. We've told the story, and nothing happened. Many are traumatized, demoralized, not just because nothing happened, they haven't seen accountability, no one was, held for all the crimes, the war crimes that have been committed, but because they are seeing complicity in Western capitals, Israeli allies, and bias in international media. And that's the demoralization part. I am still recovering from that myself, but I want to just tell you that I have decided 7 years ago that I'm going to leave CPJ after the number of journalists were killed on my watch over the course of 5 years exceeded 200 journalists in the Middle East. I promised myself I'm not going to be there when it's 300. And that 300 just happened in the last 6-7 months. That put the number of journalists who've been killed in the Middle East since 2011 at exactly half of journalists killed worldwide on the same period. 1 of every 2 journalists killed worldwide were killed in the Middle East since 2011. I'm not saying that to say, there is an endless suffering, but to say that impunity happens when we look the other way, when we see that certain people matter and certain people not. And impunity, like a virus, knows no borders. And also, like violence, cannot stop without people standing up. I was going to end by talking a little bit more about what have been done in terms of sanctions, but I think most importantly, the demoralization comes from those people on the ground knowing that there are safeguards in US government laws, in UN institutions, on UN human rights bodies, and European institutions that can stop full-fledged genocide that we're seeing right now. And it hasn't been used. But more recently, more and more, we're seeing some of it being offered on the table, including pausing arms supply, including sanctioning those soldiers involving in human rights violations. And those where steps are encouraged, I think we should all push for them, but they wouldn't have happened without Palestinians in Gaza continuing to inspire us, journalists in Gaza continuing to inspire us, and people all over the world continuing to protest in encampments and in election system, including voting undecided. That's, I think, what will help us today feel undefeated. But I want to end by saying we are not going to win unless censorship ends in Gaza, censorship ends in Israel, and censorship ends here in this city. I'm happy to answer any more questions later.
And I do want to remind the audience watching the live stream to you can submit questions throughout the discussion. And for those in the room, there will be people walking around picking up your questions. Eman, I want to turn to you. You left Gaza in 2014, and you've been posting and following the war tirelessly on Instagram, and you've become a source of news for me on what's happening. And you are also in touch very closely with journalists who are on the ground, your former colleagues. And I'm wondering if you can share your perspective on that, as you are a journalist here in the US and seeing the discourse in journalism, among journalists and in the industry here. Like, what, you have many different vantage points, and I'm wondering how you think of all this.
I'm distraught. My heart is set on fire. You're gonna see tears, so just get ready. My colleagues in Gaza are also my friends, so there's no way to disconnect the two. I spent my lifetime in Gaza. I lived in Gaza. It's my home. And my colleagues are my circle. Everyone in Gaza have a big family. I don't, so that's family. And when I moved here after my daughter got injured, so it was a forcible move. And she's a US citizen, so the US government did us no favors. But when I came here, everyone was my savior. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to endorse this journalist who's coming from Gaza. Everyone wanted to extend help and wanted to genuinely be there for me. So with the genocide happening in Gaza now, I'm just distraught of the silence, the complicity, the abandonment that my colleagues are experiencing. And I'm just like, I'm one of you, and so are they. And I don't understand, where did the disconnect happen? Why am I a human but not them? And why were you so eager to help me in very similar circumstances, but not them? And you don't have to do anything, you just have to speak up. And it's very much like what Karen said. We've seen it when Afghanistan, Ukraine, even Iraq, but when you see it with Gaza, and it's a full-blown genocide, and it's not just silence, it's dehumanization. It's, are they journalists though? Can we count them as? And because my circle is journalists, because my friends are journalists, my community was annihilated. So at the beginning I was counting, now I can't count. I can't count who are getting killed. I can only count those who are alive. And I can't process, because processing means I'm going to be crippled, and I can't be there for the ones who are alive. And I don't know how we got here, to this level of inhumanity. I don't understand how, because I put journalists on a pedestal for the longest. I thought we're so educated, we're so well informed, it's our job to hold those in power continuously, to hold them accountable. We're the checks and balances when the checks and balances are absent. We're the ones who investigate. And so, who hold us accountable when we're this complicit, when we're this biased, when we're this unable to see each other as humans, and for what? And so every time that the conversation gets pushed and pulled to, let's allow foreign journalists to get into Gaza, and I'm like, the problem is not in the coverage. The problem is in protecting the coverage. The coverage is top-notch. I'm continuously working with the ones who are still alive to apply for grants, to enhance the edit. And I'm like, how are you guys doing this? If I was covering, I would just throw the images raw and be like, take it. But the problem is that if you want to allow foreign journalists in, which take it up with the apartheid state, because that's not us who are blocking it. Sure, I would love to see, I would not love to see, but I would love to see how the world would react when white journalists start to drop. Because we've seen 6 aid workers, white, foreign aid workers, get killed by Israel, and we've seen the drastic different reaction. And so I would not, absolutely not wish this pain on anyone, because it's not crippling. I don't know if I continuously doubt my ability to survive the pain of losing one more, and I continue to lose one more. And so I don't know how can anyone go through this. And I wonder if maybe we need to go through it collectively, so my people would stop dying. And everyone keeps on pushing, like, oh, we need foreign journalists inside of Gaza, but not for the coverage to improve. We need it for different reasons here, and I'm not sure they are asking for the same things that we're asking for. And as I was covering Gaza, I now see that we're all disposable for the media, and I keep on shouting at the top of my lungs, saying, your last resort to just proclaim your integrity as journalists is to disconnect yourself from the for-profit media organizations. Because what keeps us in line, what keeps us together in one team, foreign journalists or not, is that you're journalists and we're journalists, but the media is not the same as journalists. The media is media. It's clicks, it's profit, it's views. The journalists are journalists, and without you, they don't have content. They don't have credibility. They don't have anything whatsoever. I hope I answered your question.
You did. You did. How are your colleagues, your friends, managing this themselves? The idea that they have the burden of telling us what is going on, showing us what's going on, but they also are not getting the same kind of respect. What are they telling you about that? Is that something they feel or notice?
They absolutely feel it. They absolutely are aware that they are aware, but at the same time, they have the intelligence to separate the media and their journalists. They have the intelligence to disconnect between the media machine and the journalists who work as part of that corporate. And so that keeps them in tune with the hope that there's integrity, that there's a mission that we all work for. They don't see the dehumanization as glaring as we do because they are not in the processing phase. We are, so we're able to process way more than they are. And I'm thankful for that because they don't feel the rage that we do, and they don't feel the pain on the same level. They are in the survival mode. And also they have to deal with much bigger and heavier burden than we do. And so we're the ones who are pointing the fingers and holding those accountable on their behalf. And we don't want them to be in that space just yet because it's too much to put on their shoulders. But at the same time, we also don't want them to fall into the traps of being exploited. So it's a tough equation to solve. We don't want to poison the water for their opportunities that they might have to have their stories told and heard, and we don't want to take their agency, but we also want to protect them. So it's kind of we don't want to talk on their behalf. We want them to make the decisions, but they are very well aware. Like there was a big group of them that decided they don't want to work with BBC Arabic. They don't want to work with BBC in general, with all their branches. Just the other week, and we had to listen. Why was that? So we wouldn't have our input involved. And they had their mindset, and they facilitated with their language, with their passive language continuously. They were part of our genocide facilitation. It's not the only international media organization that is out there, so we're not working with them. And that was a moment where we were like, okay, they're not naive. We're not going to be babysitting anyone here. They're good.
I think everything that all of you said today begs the question of why. One question that came through from our audience watching the live stream is, why are Palestinian journalists not receiving the same level of solidarity and advocacy efforts to guarantee their physical safety, but also to raise awareness on the people who have already been killed? Why do you think that is? What do you think is at the root of it? Eman, I'll start with you.
I think it's complicity. There are so many organizations that don't want to be seen as speaking up against the Israeli apartheid state. They don't want to be seen as as they are political. And that's just not possible and not feasible when you have more than 100 journalists being targeted and killed, surgical airstrikes taking them out. That's just not possible. You cannot be more clear and complicit when you don't call it genocide when it's genocide, and when you tiptoe around it, and when you say Palestinians dead, drop dead, heart attacks around the world, in Palestine specifically, in Gaza. And it's also part of the dehumanization that we've seen at play for decades almost now. It's been 75, 76 years of genocide and of ethnic cleansing. And when we come to journalists, you just have to be in solidarity with journalists And they are incapable of doing that. It's as simple as that. And they are like, well, but it's Israel. It's a lot of complicity because of the politics that they've had at play for years and years and years now. And that's my opinion, but it's also the facts that we're seeing and the numbers that cannot lie and the images that had been documented. They are very happy to take videos and photos from photojournalists and journalists in Gaza, but they are muting their voices, the narrative, the text. And when we work in Gaza and we have a foreign journalist, no matter who that foreign journalist is, they need an army of us to work with them to make it possible for them to get their story. They need fixers, they need translators, they need drivers. They need us to vouch for them with the locals to get that story for them to be trusted. They parachute, and we need to work around them to get them that trust, even if they stay there for a month. And they think that they are more credible than us. Without us, they don't have a story. And then we need them to tell our story. It's not even laughable, it's insulting. And then when we're the ones getting killed, they don't have the words to say Israel killed Palestinian journalists. So, I mean, it's complicity. It's complicity and the lack of having a backbone, because donors will pull the funding. Then why do you have those donors? Maybe you shouldn't have them. Maybe your donors are complicit. Maybe Zionism is the plague you need to get rid of, not the journalism.
I can speak to a little bit of sort of some of the, I would say, emotional, not even emotional dynamics, but frankly, there is force and punishment for showing solidarity to Palestinian journalists. I mean, it's been reported, if people saw a few months ago, journalists from a number of outlets who decided to sign a letter of solidarity and support and critique of Western coverage were punished, were taken off of coverage, were lost their jobs over that. I've had conversations with certain people when you bring up these double standards, almost like, just direct quote, I'm tired of Palestinians getting all this sympathy. It's this, it's not just an apathy, it's enforced. It's the threat of punishment in a zero-sum game, and we're seeing that sort of zero-sum game in terms of quote-unquote being pro-Palestinian, anti-genocide means you must not have sympathy, that you don't care about Israelis, or that you don't care, that it's anti-Semitic to have any sort of sympathy for Palestinians and, by extension, Palestinian journalists. So I think, that we have to hold these our media houses to account for when they punish us for doing the basics of just showing solidarity with our colleagues in Palestine or in even that, right? Look at me. And I'd say also this is probably the most insidious form of the censorship, is the self-censorship. Yeah. Is people who know they're saying facts and they know that the style books do not capture what they're doing, but they've internalized the fear and they catch themselves and censor themselves. That's the hardest obstacle to overcome. It's not an excuse, you should still overcome it, but journalists, especially who are facing the onslaught, and these are coordinated attacks, right? And again, this is not to even at all compared to literal journalists who are being targeted. but we know that there's a history when it comes to international solidarity movements, even the civil rights movements, that it is necessary for minoritized populations to have these international solidarity movements. And we know that here in Washington, in the US, in the imperial core, where we do have the privilege and the platforms and the safety, there is that obligation, but it means that the oppressive forces have known that international solidarity movements, I do think that targeting particularly of Black voices on Palestine has definitely been by design, especially 10 years since Ferguson. I think that's where a lot of Black journalists and Black voices started to make those parallels with the situation. And you're also seeing a lot of Black journalists, frankly, being targeted for that. All that to say is that there, I think, is an intentional targeting of the international sort of solidarities with Palestinians, including Palestinian journalists, that you are also, again, targeted with losing your job. I've had hit pieces all over the place against me, campaigns for me to be fired and to be removed. That, you know, not everybody has been prepared for. But again, this is, and to the sort of material support of it, we saw in Ukraine these efforts to raise money and funds and supplies for Ukrainian journalists, to even be able to support Ukrainian journalists. On the back end, I was in conversations with folks, people with my employer, about how can we, at the very least, can we get them kits, can we get them vests, can we get the tools, maybe at least some material support. And of course, having to deal with checkpoints, the IDF inspection, all of that. So it's not to say that some of those conversations hadn't been had, but it is nowhere near what has been done. Again, what we've seen done for Ukraine's journalists. Again, it's not, you hear the sort of excuse, well, it's a war. People die in war. Journalists are doing their job. And I'm like, again, you didn't say that for Ukraine's journalists. We tried to get them the aid and the support and the elevation. So again, you're just not applying that same standard to Palestinian journalists. So it goes to, this is an active prevention of making connections, an active prevention of cutting the ties, cutting the solidarity, cutting the sympathy. The sort of complicity, I'm just trying to complicate the notion that the complicity and the apathy just kind of drop from the sky. It's enforced. And so again, I'm hoping that the more of us that keep speaking out, keep giving others courage to do the same. And little by little, it's not enough to, obviously, like, hopefully it's slowing or increasing the costs, the activist told me, increasing the cost of the repression, that it becomes harder and harder once we've seen all the images to justify what's happening. But yeah, again, I've never seen anything like this before in my whole life or career. So it's tough.
I can take a stab at this. I am no longer at CPJ, so I can be more critical of the media industry. Before, I had to protect everyone, but I think now I can say it's much more simpler. It is structural racism. It is a country like this that used to be apartheid, was settler colonists supporting an apartheid settler colonist state. And in my mind, this was all about the debate, like, is Israel a democracy? It can be a democracy with subjugating Palestinians in Tel Aviv, in the West Bank, in Gaza. And I think in so many ways, people will try to say, okay, it's an illiberal democracy, it's whatever. They are trying to make a connection with someone that looked like them. That's what comes down to it. And again, it is complicity if you're thinking, oh, well, they have subscribed into one of the camps. But it's more natural for them to be in that camp because it is structural. I'll stop here.
And I want to remind the audience that you can submit your questions on the index cards. I do want to take some from you all. How much of this do you think is about race? Like, I know we can't have a perfect Venn diagram. I mean, it's complicated and it's squishy, but where do you think that comes into play? Like, if this number of journalists were being killed in Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine is a whole country. Gaza is not a country, it is a strip of land the size of Philadelphia, and this happened over the course of 7 months. So it's not even apples to apples in any way, but what do you think about that factor, the racial factor, the fact that these are Black and brown people that are being killed? And yeah, I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, it definitely makes a difference. As we mentioned earlier, yes, Shireen is a US citizen, but she was also Palestinian. So she didn't receive the justice that she deserved yet. So had all these over 100 Palestinian journalists been killed elsewhere, for example, Ukraine, then no, there would have been outrage. Western media would have been going crazy, trying ways to impose sanctions on Russia, on killing journalists. So no, definitely race is a factor, and it's also the systemic racism that's inherent within various media outlets and organizations. So yeah, definitely I would say race is a factor.
And Lina, a question did come through about what justice looks like for you, what justice looks like for your family.
For our family, justice is holding not just the Israeli soldier who pulled the trigger accountable, but also the entire system that continues to perpetuate this kind of violence towards Palestinians and towards journalists in this case. It's also imposing sanctions on the specific unit that targeted, that was in Jenin, in the area where Shireen was killed. And the unit is known. It was also the UN, the latest investigative report that was published by the UN earlier in October of last year, also found the name of the soldier, but the name of the commander, sorry, but that was not made public. So yes, there are so many ways that that there can be accountability, that there can be justice, but unfortunately that's not happening. So for us, it's continuing to put pressure on the ICC to move forward with their investigation, and for there to be more transparency and communication from the administration regarding the latest the FBI investigation.
And Eman, this question is addressed to you. Craig Mukhaibar, the former UN official, calls what is happening in Gaza a textbook case of genocide. Why do you think that term isn't being used widely in media, either as a direct reference to what is happening, or even in the reportage that there is a large contingent of people that say that it's happening? Why do you think that that is basically eliminated from the coverage?
Because it's going to hold Israel accountable. Because then genocide needs someone to commit genocide. And Israel strives on the promotion of branding itself as a victim. And a victim cannot commit genocide. And if a victim commits genocide, then it's not a victim. A victim cannot go and commit genocide against those who are oppressing the victim. It just doesn't make sense. That's not math, that's science fiction. And even in science fiction, that's not how it works. I have not watched that just yet. And so it exposes that poor propaganda that the Israeli apartheid is pushing down everyone's throat. And it's really just the fact that Palestinians are being subjected to genocide, and that ethnic cleansing that had been going on for 75, now 76, because we don't stop counting when genocide is being exposed, had been going on, is happening. And that's, the world needs to interfere and do something. And when it doesn't, it becomes complicit. And that complicity means that they also need to be held accountable. So now that the ICC might be issuing an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, we're seeing everyone's getting stressed, and the bullies on Capitol Hill are sending letters saying, oh, you cannot do this. And so it sends everyone on a frenzy. And the more we say it, also, it becomes harder to dehumanize Palestinians. It becomes harder to call them human animals, because that's also textbook genocide. And it helps stopping the massacres and the bloodshed that is being directed towards Palestinians. And that's just the fact. And you see it all the time in the talking points for all Zionists and in the propaganda. It's war. And in war, people get killed. Then why are they just getting killed on the Palestinian side in those outrageous numbers? And why is it acceptable to be on the Palestinian side? And then when they want to flip it, they are like, if anything, it's a genocide towards Jews. They're like, well, it's Israelis, and no, but okay, it's a genocide. And so it is a genocide, and it's a genocide by the statement of the UN and now The Hague, and we just cannot keep on falling through we just cannot keep on going back. I have not so far seen my loved ones saying, oh, the Palestinian F-16 or F-35 went, or our tanks did not invade just yet. I'm yet to see that. That's when we have a war. And I have not seen that. Our troops did not invade. And Hamas is not an army. They can say whatever they want. They play down Hamas when they want to, and they play them up when they want to. That's not how it goes. So that's not a war, it's a genocide. And if it wasn't genocide, then why the hell am I losing a loved one every 24 to 72 hours? Because if someone can come and live my life, they will see that's a genocide.
And I want to end, we're almost to time, and I want to end on some of the work that these journalists are doing. So the stories that you found most meaningful, a journalist that you've been following that you want to highlight. And I want to start with you, Lina. We do have a question from the audience saying that Shireen was so important to them, and asking you what the most meaningful story that she has done throughout her career, something that you think of.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because right before I flew into the States, I went to the Al Jazeera office in Ramallah, and I sat with Al Jazeera's bureau chief, Walid Al-Omari, and he was giving us the latest updates on the museum that's going to be established in Shireen's name in Ramallah. And he was saying they've archived more than 3,000 reports that Shireen has worked on over the course of 25 years. This does not include the special programs and the segments that she had produced and presented. And he said it will take around 7 days, 24 hours for someone to sit down and watch all these reports. And he also added that if you were to watch all of her reports, she covers the entire history of Palestine. That includes the culture, the education side, society, from all its aspects. So that adds to what Karen was saying earlier. the assault on the cultural heritage. And to me, it's very hard to pinpoint one specific report of Shireen's because each one was unique. Each one conveyed a story, it conveyed a voice from different parts of Palestine, from different cities, from different towns and villages. So she was able to cover every single story. Even if she was covering a daily raid, she would find one specific story from that specific raid to make sure she highlights that story. So for me, it's not easy to pinpoint one specific story, but I would say one of the ones that I always go back and watch is a segment she did on Jerusalem, and it was the economy in Jerusalem under occupation and how it really impacts the Palestinians. But another one which actually inspired me to write my master's thesis was the struggle to access water in the Jordan Valley, especially in the northern parts of Jordan Valley. And I remember I interviewed her for my thesis, and she provided me with some of the most insightful information because she knew every part of Palestine in all its entirety. So yeah, it's difficult to put into words, which are my favorite, but I would think these are some of the ones that I can remember from the top of my head. But also I think I'll take this opportunity to say that as we're approaching the 2nd year anniversary, our family will be launching the Shireen Abu Akleh Foundation, which will it will aim to raise 10 scholarships on an annual basis. And I think with the number of Palestinian journalists killed in Gaza, this is a way to honor them and honor their lives. And this is the least we can do to give back to the legacy of Shireen and the work she's done over the past 25 years.
Well, I think we do have a few more minutes. Do any of you want to say anything? Thank you, Lina.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
I think because we're in 2024, many of us do not realize or do not remember that also speaking up about genocide and calling it genocide was not easy ever in the past. People got killed for calling it such, whether it was the Jewish Holocaust, whether it was Rwanda, whether it was Cambodian genocide, whatever kind of genocide, Holocaust, Native Americans who were never recognized, even after killing 50 million of them. I think people forget or underestimate or think that it was easy. Now people get fired because it's modern history, and that's not nothing, but people get fired. Back then, they used to get killed. And so recognizing that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide is not an easy thing because it was never, ever easy to recognize an injustice while it's happening. It's gonna be much easier, and those who denied it, their life is gonna get way much harder. Jobs are gonna get harder. Being able to show their faces is gonna be much harder, and that's just the truth of how history works. But just let's remember that it was never easy, ever, in the course of history. That's just life.
I guess I have some hope in this new generation. I mean, I think the new generation is probably Israel's biggest problem. The young people who forms like these parasocial relationships in a way, like who, even myself, waking up Bisana Alda and Motaz, checking to see, you know, I think she'd open her videos with, hello, I'm still alive, and then going into her coverage. And generationally, the fact that, again, through the images, through the video, you cannot, as we said earlier this morning, there's something, the images you just cannot deny, like those pictures. And at a certain level, though, it's also like this question of, and I think Motaz said this once, we're not just content to be consumed. Like the question of how much, and this is even a question in terms of Black Lives Matter, I mean, when you're seeing people die on your cameras every single day, how much death does it take for you to act? How much death does it take until you become desensitized to it? But I do think, I mean, looking at the campus protests, looking at the young people who are just, you know, willing to put, you can't fool them anymore. There's a reason why they're going after TikTok. There's a reason why Meta is shadow banning certain types of content. But the resilience and the resolve, I think, of this younger generation, I'm hoping, well, I think part of the work that we're doing is trying to change culture and discourse, and that's a lot of heavy work. But I always see that politics follows culture, not the other way around. And so what we're seeing with these movements, what we're seeing with speaking, all of that is to normalize Palestinian humanity and to like do what we can, those of us who are not Palestinians, who are outside, to say we're increasing the cost of this repression and we're increasing the value of all of our lives, like by speaking out and by refusing to be freaking gaslit and lied to. So that's at least where I'm putting a bit of hope is the young folks, even, you know, the young Jewish generation even. Israel's never going to be seen the same after. There's no amount of PR, I think, that can really change what's happening. So, yeah, that's not to say that the young people are the only ones who should bear the brunt. We all do, but it's the status quo is now completely different, I think.
Well, I want to thank all of you for speaking today. I know this is not easy to talk about, and I know that your presence in this room is the result of a lot of personal turmoil, a lot of tragedy, and that you've had the great misfortune of having to witness that up close. But I think that your insights have been so valuable to everyone in this room and the audience watching. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you all for coming today. And for those of you watching on the live stream, this concludes the day's symposium. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Arab Center for coming and for listening and for being a part of this incredibly valuable discussion. Thank you.